And I'll make this other little announcement. I was lingering as long as I could to keep them coming in, and I wore a mask, and I will after I finish this lesson here, but I will plan to leave pretty immediately because I just don't know how much of a carrier I am. With everybody else in the family being sick at different days, I just don't want to think of myself to be a carrier and the possibility of anyone coming down with what we've had. So if I get out in a hurry, which I plan to, don't take that as a slight or anything of that nature. Just understand I'm trying to protect you and also trying to do what I think is maybe best in the situation. We're studying a theme. By a theme, we mean a main point, a central point. And that is from a statement found in Psalms, the 23rd chapter and verse 4, where David said, "For thou art with me." He was talking about when you walk through the valley of the shadow of death. But concerning that statement, "For thou art with me," we can certainly understand and see that there are other things to which this statement would apply. And I know you've heard them. I know I've done sermons on main themes. I like the statement that Jesus made in Matthew 19 and verse 6 when he said, "What therefore God hath joined together." And so we know that the context in Matthew 19 is the husband and wife, that God has a responsibility, a role in the marriage relationship. But we also have taken that the fact that, as it says, that what God has joined together, and we apply it to the fact that God has joined together faith and works. Those are two things that are inseparable as far as God is concerned, although man tries to make a distinction that you can do one and not have to have the other. Certainly, God has joined together baptism and salvation. And of course, we know that man tries to separate the two, that you can be saved and baptism has nothing to do with you. Concerning the fact that many people try to distinguish and separate Christ and the church. We've been studying that on Sunday morning, how that many people want to just preach Jesus and not the plan, nothing to do with the church or anything of that nature. But we know that God has joined those two things together. So that's what we mean by a main point. And that's what we're doing here in our study. Lesson 1, we looked at how that there were some 88 characteristics or qualities of God that should want us, desire us to have him to be with us in whatever it is that we are engaged in as a Christian. In lesson 2, we continued there to start looking at really what the rest of the workbook is dealing with, and that is the various areas and the times in our lives when we should want God to be with us. And so lesson 3, we saw how that we want the Lord to be with us when we're trying to teach others his word. And that covers the entire arena of our teaching God's word, whether as parents to our children, whether as Christians to sinners, whether as Christians to other Christians in order to edify and strengthen them, or as us as faithful Christians trying to renew or to restore those that have become unfaithful. In lesson 4, we saw that there's a need for us to have Jesus with us when we are suffering as a Christian. And we saw how that that's truly the case with the apostles and with the early disciples in the first century. And certainly we ought not to be surprised or to think otherwise concerning the fact that we too can be and will be called upon to suffer. And then, of course, in our study that we're here in lesson 5, we are looking at the fact that we need the Lord to be with us when we are growing old and when we are experiencing the physical and the mental infirmities that generally are associated with the aging process. So we're at the point where we left off 2 weeks ago at studying and looking at what the scriptures record about some older people in the scriptures and see how that they continued to be great even in their later years. And we begin that part of our study by looking at Abraham and Sarah. And that's the one that we got through before our time ran out. So, Lord willing, let's pick up with page 25 of our workbook with the matter of Job. And we'd have to turn it on, wouldn't it? Okay. We know that Job, this man, is certainly very familiar. He's known by all Bible students as a man of great patience. In fact, James refers to him in this very way. In James 5, verse 11, Brother Byron, read that for us.
Oh, we count them happy which endure. We have heard the patience of Job, and have seen the end of the Lord. The Lord is very good and of tender mercy.
All right. Behold, we count them happy which endure. Sometimes the word endurance is translated patience. Patience is endurance. And it's those two things that are essential to each other. So we count them happy which endured, and James then says, we've heard of the patience of Job. And we have seen the end of the Lord, that the Lord is very pitiful and of tender mercy. We know the story of Job. We know how that there were many things that happened in his life that obviously he had no understanding, no inkling of why these things are happening. And that these things that were happening to him were catastrophic. We'll look at him here in just a minute. But we know what was going on in the background. He didn't. We know from 1st and 2nd chapters that there's a conversation taking place between Satan and the Lord, that Satan accuses Job of being faithful to the Lord only because of the blessings that the Lord had heaped upon him. Now, that can be, and sometimes is, sad to say, true of a lot of Christians. They are faithful because of things going well in their lives. But of course, what the devil proposed was to take away those blessings and see if it is that he will still remain faithful to you. So in what we see, as you know, this great man was richly blessed when he had stood the test, though he did not understand why he had to suffer the loss of his children, the loss of his possessions, and of course, we know he also suffered the loss of his physical well-being with the boils that were inflicted upon him. But we see Job having triumphed gloriously over his temptations. The record then says of him in chapter 42 of Job, verses 12 and 13. Brother George, can you read that for us?
The Lord bless the latter end of Job more than he began, for he had 6,000, 14,000 sheep, 6,000 down, 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 she-goats, and they also had 7 sons and 3 daughters.
All right. We know that all of this was what was taken away from him. Job was a rich man, just in material possessions. He was truly a rich man from the standpoint of a family. And that's even bared out in the 1st and 2nd chapters, how that Job was very conscientious toward his children. And It was his prayer that his children would be faithful and true in their lives to the Lord. And yet, all of that is stripped from him in just a very, very brief period of time. And so, hidden, as it were, behind a body, racked with pain, repulsive to the eyes, this sweet spirit still trusted in his God. So we see then, I could get that up there, that this is the thing that is truly the remarkable quality about Job. Remember what his wife said? Job, you just need to curse God and die. You just need to get it over with. And that would have been the tendency of someone if they only served God faithfully because God was blessing them. As soon as their blessings would have been removed, so would their faithfulness to the Lord. But there's a lot of lessons that we need to learn from Job. I trust and I hope that we never have to endure the pain and the suffering, the loss, to the extent that Job did. There have been many in this audience that have lost children, grandchildren. Can you imagine losing, as we read there a moment ago, 7 sons? Can you imagine losing 3 daughters? That within itself. And we know what physical pain does to us. And that's one of the things that we have to learn to deal with the older we get, because in the normal course of things, our bodies are going to go through stages that are going to bring upon us sickness, disease, things that we may have to struggle with for a while, maybe things that we may have to put up and endure with till our last breathing moment. But these are the things that even Satan knew can and does serve as temptations to draw us away from our faithfulness to God. But we see here that he trusted his God, and not only that, contrary to the accusations of his so-called friends, he had not forgotten him. God had not forgotten him. But then we know that after it was all over with, God showered him with the blessings of heaven once these things were ended. You know, I got to thinking about it. There's not really much of any way that we can determine an age number here in when did these things in Job's life come upon him. For him to have amassed all of these physical possessions, we know that would require certainly a definite amount of time. For him to have 7 sons and 3 daughters, that too would involve a period of time. But we know there's a statement that we can read in Job chapter 42. We read verses 12 and 13. If you have to have your Bibles open now to Job, look on down in that same 42nd chapter, and let's look at verse 16. After this, that is, after all of these things have been restored unto Job, after this lived Job 140 years, and he saw his sons and his sons' sons, even 4 generations. So we know that after these things had come upon him, he lived another 140 years. And looking at several commentaries on the book of Job, it seemed as if most of the commentators, for whatever it's worth, tended to estimate Job to be somewhere in the vicinity of 70 when these things happened to him. And again, it's reasonable when you again consider the things that he had amassed materially, the families that now, and of course, they have children of their own. So I think we're still talking about, as far as you and I are concerned, as far as our concept of old age, that if indeed it was in the age of nearly of 70 that these happened to Job, that certainly this can and does have a proper application for us today concerning the matter of how we would want God to be with us when we are advancing in our years upon this earth. Any comments, any questions on Job? And I said there's many, many, many lessons that can be learned from him. But the fact is, God, it seemed, had forsaken him, but not at all. That was not the case. And so the case may be with us, whether because of things that happened to us, because of sicknesses, because of age. Sometimes we may tend to think that God has forsaken us, that God has forgotten us. But let that not be the case, and let us think about these individuals like Abraham and Sarah, of Job. And then this one that we're going to look at, and David. David, what's he called there in 2 Samuel 23, verse 1, David? David, what's David called? So, all right, the sweet psalmist of Israel. And he's also pronounced in Acts 13 and verse 22 to be what, Nick? Right? A man after, and of course the statement in Acts 13 is the declaration of God making the statement, but we know that the man, the pronoun, has reference to God, that he is a man after God's own heart. But we know David too, he had to endure adversities. And being temporarily expelled by his son from his own throne, he must have felt the pain of frustration and worry. And in his life was not one without blemish, neither. Since he took the wife of Uriah, whose death he deliberately planned in 2 Samuel 11, verses 14 and 15, so that he, in all of doing this, might cover up the sin that he had committed. Let's look at that 14th and 15th verse of 2 Samuel 11. Well, could you read those?
And it came to pass in the morning that David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. And he wrote in the letter, saying, set ye Uriah in the foreground of the hottest battle, and retire ye from him, that he may be smitten and die.
All right. I'm sure we're familiar with the things that we're talking about here, that he indeed was tempted and gave in to the temptation. He, as James says, temptation comes upon us, yet we need to understand that it has a progression, and we need to stop that progression. If we do not, then we end up being where David was with Bathsheba. Yes, we can be tempted, but we don't need to act upon those temptations. David did. But as always with sin, I think there's a statement that we've all heard many people make, and that is, sin takes us further than we intended to go. So yes, the sin of fornication was one thing, but now the news of a pregnancy and the desire to cover up this entire matter, leading to what we've just read here. David wrote a letter to Joab. Joab was the one that was in charge of the battle, and he sent it by the very hand of Uriah. Uriah delivered his own death sentence. And what he wrote in that letter was, set Uriah in the forefront of the hottest battle and pull away from him. Leave him. He's going to be on his own. He's not going to have his fellow comrades on each side of him to in any way add a factor of his survival. No, there is not going to be a survival for Uriah. And he was smitten, and he died. So we see then that yet, unlike some people, David could say in 2 Samuel chapter 12 and verse 13, Stephen?
I have sinned against the Lord.
Okay? And this, of course, is when Nathan, you remember the prophet, came and gave David a little illustration that, of course, was pointing the finger directly at David, but yet David got the point. And with that, with understanding it, David didn't do like some people did. David said, I have sinned. And we see, as we have already seen, the Lord did not forsake David when he became old. In 1 Kings 1 and verse 1, we have him being described as what, Brother Rodney?
As old and stricken in years.
All right. He was old and stricken in years. And God, yet being old and stricken in years, God confirmed his kingdom, David's kingdom, through, who was it?
Solomon.
Through Solomon. And even through, who else? Adonijah. And Adonijah exalted himself and tried to take the authority, the kingdom away. And we see that particularly, particularly in 1 Kings, well, in 1 Kings 5 and verse 1, then Adonijah, the son of Haggith, exalted himself, saying, I will be king. And he prepared his chariots and his horsemen and 50 men to run before him. So he had every intention of taking the throne away from David, away from Solomon. But it's in verse 39 of 1 Kings 5 that it says that David was old and full of days, and he made Solomon his son king over Israel, because that was what God was wanting to take place. God was wanting the throne of David to continue through Solomon, not through Adonijah, even with the best laid plans that Adonijah had to try to overthrow and to upset this succession, this reign of Solomon. It did not work. So we see God still remaining faithful to that covenant, that promise, that it would be through his seed, through his lineage, that there would be one that would be raised to sit upon his throne, and his throne would last forever. Not talking about a temporal throne, not the kind of physical, material throne that David occupied in the city of Jerusalem, but an eternal, a spiritual throne, a throne in the heavens, not thrones like here on earth that can be overcome, that can be rebelled against, that can be conquered, but this throne that David's heir, would inherit would be an everlasting, eternal throne. Then we see a statement that was made by Elihu to Job. Of course, Elihu was one of the supposed friends of Job. And that's a statement that he makes that says a whole lot. And in Job 32 and verse 9, what we see here is that they are great men, but sometimes they're not always wise. So we need to be careful. We that are older need to be careful that, we're not going to be automatically do everything that's right just because we're old. Old age is no guarantee that we're going to have the wisdom and execute the judgment and make the right decisions. But what we see here is in a statement that Job's friend made to him, and that is, neither do the aged understand judgment. So what we're seeing here is that sometimes even with knowledge, even with experience that comes with being older, older people may still yet do some things which are not proper, not unseemly. To look at another translation, the English Standard Version says, nor the age who understand what is right. So certainly we see another part of old age that we don't need to ignore, we don't need to tread over and treat lightly, because of it certainly being a very distinct possibility, a reality. Let's go back and take a closer look at Solomon. When his name is mentioned, what's the first thing that pops into your mind? Wise man, right? We all remember the story of how that God gave him a choice. God, I guess you could say it in one way, God gave Solomon a blank check, and Solomon could fill it in for whatever it was that he might want. Wealth, fame, all of the things that a materialistic, fleshly minded person would certainly jump at the opportunities if he was given that chance. But we all know that Solomon, though he had the choice of anything he wanted, he chose wisdom. And we know that with this great wisdom, he could keep peace with the nations around him. The reign of Solomon, from the time of David's death until the time of Solomon's death, was truly a time of great prosperity for the nation of Israel. They were at peace. It's hard to have prosperity when you're fighting wars and your economy is being drained in order to continue the war efforts. There was no war. Because of this wisdom, Solomon was able to keep peace with the nations around. He even could be what we would call a magnet of those that were far and near, because we see that he excited the curiosity of people. We're familiar with the story of the Queen of Sheba. She heard so many amazing things about Solomon that it was difficult for her to believe them. So she made that long trip to Solomon. And when she got there, she made the statement to him that even that which I've heard is far beyond what I've seen. Nothing compares to what I've witnessed what I beheld as she made that visit with Solomon. And he could settle disagreements. I guess probably one of the things that sticks in our mind, you remember the two women that brought the baby to him? One of them was claiming that it was hers, and the other one was claiming that it was hers. And remember, Solomon made that one statement, fetch me a sword. He knew that that would reveal the identity of the true mother. So just instances like that. And yet, in all of this great man did not always act wisely. We go to 1 Kings chapter 11, and we see that he laid aside this wisdom, and he followed his own inclinations. Verse 1 says he loved many women. Verse 1 says he loved many strange women, meaning that Solomon took women from other nations other than Israel. The problem was he certainly loved men and women, and that was a problem, but to add to that problem was the strange women, the heathens, the idolaters women that were in other nations. So verse 2 says that he ignored God's warning about forming ties with the heathen. Because in verse 3, what did we read, Brother Henson?
Surely they will turn away your heart after their gods.
For surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. Isn't that an amazing tendency? And yet we're not immune. And what I mean by that is that as Christians, we're not immune to being having our hearts turned away by the simple understanding that we live in the world. We know that we're in the world, but we know that we're not to be of the world, but yet we still know the influence the world has. As best as we can, to try to isolate ourselves, as best as we can to form the right attitudes that we need to have toward the world. It's bombarding us every single day of our lives. So it's a struggle, it's a battle. And all of it is in an effort to turn away our hearts to unfaithfulness to God. Solomon was unfaithful to God because he broke God's command concerning the taking of foreign women to be wives. Well, God has warned us about being adulterers and adulteresses in the spiritual sense, hasn't he? Remember what James says? James 4, verse 4, you adulterers and adulteresses, know ye not that the friendship of this world is enmity with God? Whosoever therefore that will be a friend of the world is enemy of God. So we, to a great extent, are in the same setting, environment as Solomon was. Everything around us being an attempt to turn our hearts away from God. So, with his collection of women, well, the question is, what was his collection of women? According to verse 3. Well, verse 3, Shane.
He had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart.
So there we have it again. Verse 2, God said, they will surely turn away your hearts after other gods. Now in verse 3, we see 700 wives, 300 concubines, and the statement, his wives turned away his heart. You know, I don't know of any more persuading thing in this world to a man than his wife. That's why it's so important that Christians marry Christians, and not just Christians, they marry faithful Christians. Because in that relationship of husband and wife is the greatest influence, and it can be for good or it can be for evil, but still it's the greatest influence for either of the two. We see it, and we just don't have to look to Solomon. I'm sure we've all got our own personal stories of people that we know that maybe were once faithful to the Lord, and yet because of an unfaithful or a spouse that was not willing to become a Christian. Not to say that that person that's in that relationship would always become unfaithful, but the odds are against them, needless to say. So yes, they will surely turn your heart away from their God, and that's what his wives did. Verse 6, what we see. Philip?
And Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord.
Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord. He went off and worshiped these other gods. You know, nothing's more pleasant in a marriage relationship than to please your wife. I've got a little thing on our chest of drawers in the bedroom. A happy wife is a happy life. And you know, that's true. So what was Solomon doing? He was forgetting all about his wisdom that he possessed, and he traded it for making his wives happy. If his wives were happy, Solomon was having a good time. Who doesn't like to have a good time?
You know, if he got married every 6 months, it'd take him 350 years just to marry his wife.
And that's true. And then verse 9, what does it say, Brother Adams?
Lord was angry with Solomon because he sought the first of the Lord. What was the result of Solomon?
All right. The Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart was turned from him. And we ask from verse 11, what was the result of Solomon's sin? Well, read verse 11 for us, Tim.
Wherefore the Lord said unto Solomon, for as much as this is done of thee, and thou hast not kept my covenant and my statutes, which I have commanded thee, I will surely rend the kingdom from thee, and will give it to thy servant.
So we see the result of Solomon's actions and the consequences that it brought, not just upon him. See, that's the thing about sin. Oh yes, sin has its consequences that we, the one that has committed them, has to suffer. But sin can also have consequences that we commit that may cause others to suffer. And so here the whole nation of Israel is going to suffer. Why? Because of the wisest man that we read about in the world that did some very foolish things. Mainly, he went contrary to what God commanded him to do. So the kingdom is going to be taken from him. We know that Solomon is the last king that reigns over all 12 tribes of Israel. After Solomon, the kingdom is going to divide. And this, we see, is the heart of it, the cause of it. Sin and its consequences. Well, we almost made it to the end. I think we've got a couple more. So Lord willing, we will completely finish lesson 5 as we look at, let's continue to remember these examples of David and Solomon and understand that within us, as we grow older, it too is possible that we can do some foolish things. Sad to say, I've known of gospel preachers that have preached their lives, whole lives of truth, defended the truth. And in their old age, and I remember Brother Weiser making this statement one time because he was aware of some of these very preachers that had stood firm for the truth, and yet in their old days, they had abandoned the truth. He said that's one thing that he prayed that he would never do, that he would stand for the truth all of his life, and then in his older years, undo all of the good that he might have done. So that's something to think about. And it's whether we're gospel preachers or not, as Christians. Let's don't live our lives as Christians and then come into our older years and then, in a sense, I know we don't, but in a sense, we undo all of the good that we've done. Appreciate so much our time and our study together.